I guess as a co-founder and general partner of Hustle Fund, we've invested in over 400 startups, and we have over 1,500 angel investors who invest alongside of us as well.
Cool. And what's the size of the fund, and which fund is it?
Yeah, we are on Fund 3 right now, and that's about a $46.5 million fund.
Cool. Okay, awesome. What do you feel like your mission in life is personally and also professionally?
On the professional side, actually, I did a lot of soul searching on this. So my last company, was an ad company. I had a relatively modest exit. And so I wanted to start another company, but I wanted to be something that was my life's work. So I actually thought a lot about this and tried many experiments and worked on a number of different side projects. And then one day it sort of dawned on me, because I had been mentoring companies, angel investing in companies, and I realized that actually I really loved working with startups. And it was startups have problem sets that I know very well, having been a founder for many years. So my mission from a professional standpoint is to actually help startup ecosystems everywhere and great founders be able to get access to capital, knowledge, and networks. So, we're hoping at Hustle Fund to what we call democratize wealth through startups.
Where did the ethos come from to do like kind of the like spray and pray approach of multiple small checks?
I think that's something that I had a lot of influence on, or rather, 500 Startups, which is the accelerator program that I had worked at and worked with for a few years prior to Hustle Fund. They had a lot of influence on my thinking around this. Certainly, I think at this point, there's a lot of data out there around portfolio construction in startups. And, I think when you invest so early, obviously it's very risky. And there are obviously pros and cons to investing super early. But if you're going to invest really early, you have to have really good portfolio construction. And for this reason, this is why actually a lot of accelerator programs, whether it's 500 or YC or Techstars or any of them, they all have a lot of startups. And if you look at a lot of pre-seed investment funds as well, they also have a lot of startups. It is one of the few ways to systematically make the model work. I think, if you have a concentrated portfolio of fewer numbers of startups, you need to be absolutely certain that the startups are going to work or something. And that's really hard to guarantee at pre-seed.
Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, you were my first check, so I was super grateful.
Thank you.
Cool. So yeah, how would you describe what you do today in terms of your day-to-day? And you definitely include parenting as a part of that.
It's funny, my son, who's my younger one, was born about 6 weeks prior to starting Hustle Fund. So
wow.
Both my personal and professional babies are growing up at the same time. And so I can see both growing up. And so I think, now on the day-to-day side of both life and work, I'm about, call it 6 years in. And I think at this point, certainly for Hustle Fund, it's a later stage startup in that it's going, things are working. We've hired a lot of people. We have, about 30 people who work at Hustle Fund now. So unlike when it was just 2 people in a garage, like when Eric and I started the firm, I'm not running around doing everything. And often I don't know exactly what is happening on a day-to-day basis and everything. And so there's a lot of trust in the people we've hired and also a lot of coordination. Like, I think my primary role now is like coordination to make sure that, everyone is on the same page, that there's or try to mitigate the chaos, try to add processes and operations so that things scale. That's how I see my role now at Hustle Fund, where actually, if I'm successful, I should be obsolete. And on the personal side, actually in a similar way, my kids are now, my younger one, like I said, is now 6. And so they, both he and my older one are on their way. And similarly, I'm not doing everything for them day to day, right? Like, I'm not changing their diapers or feeding them. They can feed themselves. They can pack their own lunch. They can, they can get their stuff together. And so it's more, I see my job as more like shepherding things to make sure that they run smoothly, and just ensuring that they also have, the tools they need to do things themselves, more or less.
Yeah. Do you prefer this or the earlier stages? in both startups and kids.
I think I prefer this all around.
Yeah.
I mean, as you know, on the startup founder side, it's just so busy when you're starting a company and it's just you running around doing everything.
Yeah.
It's easy to get burnt out. Now I think, I can definitely take a breather. I can even take a vacation and things don't fall apart. And so it's just a lot more scalable and a lot more manageable, mentally and also just generally. And then same with on the kid side of things, like, I actually never really loved the baby or the toddler stage because babies and toddlers literally need their parents for every little thing, whether it's diaper
Yeah.
changes or there's something wrong and you have to soothe them and stuff like that. And I actually find a lot of joy in, seeing them grow up and being able to learn new skills and do things themselves. I think you just sort of feel like, oh, all the work you put into parenting is going somewhere.
Yeah, that's
So
awesome.
it's surprisingly very similar on both sides, actually.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, I'd love to pivot into sort of deciding to have a baby and pregnancy and everything there. So I guess you could answer for both your kids since you have two. But something that I'm really interested in that I've been kind of working through as I've been doing these interviews is I feel like a lot of moms, especially in tech, are kind of living a double life. Like I've chatted with a lot of founders who like basically declined to interview or like wanted to wait for me to release the interview because they're like fundraising or whatever. And they're really worried about how investors will perceive them as a parent versus as just like a single female founder. And so, yeah, if there's anything you wanted to, or any threads you wanted to pull on sort of in that vein, I think that would be really interesting. But yeah, I'm curious what motivated you to have kids in the first place, and were they both planned?
They were both planned, but I would say that, just I think given my profession and lifestyle, like there was never really a great time to have children. My older one was actually born when I was running my ad startup. And then my younger one, as I kind of mentioned, was born just a few weeks before we started Hustle Fund. So in both cases, I actually did not really get much of a maternity leave, and it was like very chaotic. And so I think, to that end, I totally understand how founders think about this, because certainly for my older one, it was something that I thought a lot about, like how would my investors react to my becoming a parent. I had one investor ask me, like, how do you plan on balancing having a child and your startup? And I think, on one hand, when I heard that question, I felt like, oh, it is kind of a fair question. But on the other hand, I also felt like he would never ask a dad that question.
Yeah.
And so there is that double standard. And, I understand actually around that time, there were a couple of blog posts that had gone out about how some male investors, openly said that they didn't want to be investing in female founders who were pregnant because they felt like, well, that's just a disadvantage. And I think having gone through the gauntlet a couple of times, on one hand, yes, like I think we should be very open and say, hey, actually, it is really hard to be a new parent and also run a startup. Like I fully admit that. But I think the other thing that is important is to have long-term thinking. Like, okay, we'll all just sort of muddle through this time period. But in the grand scheme of things, when I think about Hustle Fund, I actually think about this as a 30 or 40-year journey. So the time span of 6 months when it's really hard, or 4 months when it's really hard, is nothing. I think other startups tend to think about their time span in terms of perhaps 5 to 10 years. But even on a 5 to 10-year time span, half a year is not that big of a deal. So I think investors are a little short-sighted about this, and perhaps that trickles down to founders as well. Everyone is just always so impatient. But I really do encourage people to think more long-term now. And, I think with that in mind, it can be done for sure.
So how do you suggest female founders sort of balance either being pregnant or being a parent? Like to what extent should they reveal that?
Yeah, I think actually during COVID and when video conference meetings became more of the norm, certainly for first meetings, that was actually extremely helpful to many people because you couldn't actually see whether someone was pregnant or
Yeah.
whatever, right? Like you were no longer judged so much by your appearances, unlike in in-person meetings. So I think that it is unfortunate that the world does judge people that way. And I think the more that, you obviously as a female founder, you want to do everything you can to have, um, that edge, or rather not lose that edge if you are pregnant. And so I would encourage, video conference meetings. But I think the other thing is also the world has changed and that there are more investors now who understand this. And this is why there should be more investors. So that way people have choice. I mean, for us at Hustle Fund, we've backed so many parents or people who became parents. Like, to me, it's just, that's what's going to happen. Like, and to a good extent, I actually think that's great. Like, our founders should have joy in their life, and if they want to have children, then they should be able to. So I don't think we should pressure people into sort of weird behavior. And this is, I think we are kind of entering a new stage where, now you have choice on investors to some extent, and you should go with investors who really resonate with you.
Yeah. Yeah. That was something that struck me at your guys' Hustle Fund event in SF was, just the diversity in founders, especially with age too, was something that I noticed, like that you had backed like kind of older founders or just like above the age of 30. Like, I feel like at most tech events, I meet like mainly people that are like 30 or younger. I think it's also like self-selecting, like older parents might not necessarily have the time. Cool. So how would you describe your kids' family structure?
I think because I do have a busy day job, my kids are pretty self-sufficient. And that was really important to me. And that is something, honestly, that has made my life easier. But, like, I start my calls at 7 in the morning every day, which means that when they come down to eat breakfast, they get their own breakfast, they pack all the stuff they need for school. Like, so by the time we go to school or my husband takes them to school, like, they are ready to go. Like, that is not something that we get involved with, and stuff like that. So I think that's, they for the most part can do a lot of things themselves. They can even cook. So I think that's just something that was really important to me. Like, I see my job as a parent as, you're a little bit like a coach. Actually, it's, again, has similarities to my professional life, but you're a little bit like a coach. You're not trying to do everything for them forever. So, like, your job is to get them prepared for when they turn 18 and they need to actually do everything themselves.
Yeah. That's so interesting.
So
How did you set the expectation that they need to be self-sufficient so young?
I think actually, because I see so many kids who are so coddled in this day and age, it actually was sort of a visceral reaction to me that my children just can't be like that. Like, there's so many kids who go off to college now who are literally not prepared to do anything themselves, whether it's their own laundry or, finding food for themselves or whatever it is, like, which is just sort of mind blowing. And perhaps I'm a little old fashioned. But I think, that's kind of the mode I was in, less so because, I felt like, oh, a 3-year-old should be able to do their own laundry.
Does your 3-year-old do his own laundry?
Well, he's now 6, but he does do his own laundry and has been doing his own laundry actually since then.
Oh, wow.
It's not that challenging, right? You throw the clothes in there and you press some buttons.
Did you feel the same about your birth? Like, did you feel kind of just like laissez-faire about it?
Pretty much, mostly because I didn't really have much time. Also, both of them were born early. So for the first one, my first one was born a month early. So actually, I didn't even get to do any of the birthing classes. I didn't even get to take the tour of the hospital. So you just kind of go in there and you wing things.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. So I guess that kind of leads into my next question. Like, how did you go about deciding your birth plan? Did you even create a birth plan, maybe even for your second baby? And how did you sort of think about structuring your birth team and preferences?
I don't think I even thought about it. I mean, I think the only thing that I thought about was I thought it was important to actually pick a hospital that had a good infrastructure. And by that, I mean, so I could not have predicted this, but for some odd reason, I decided to pick a hospital for my first one that had a NICU, just in case. And it turned out we needed the NICU. So because my older one was born early. But beyond that, you know, I didn't really look into very much at all.
Okay, interesting. What about for pregnancy? Like, were you doing anything to sort of optimize pregnancy, or were you just kind of like time to work?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think part of why I'm a little bit averse to this is, you know, I had picked up, I think, some materials on various things, but like, for example, I remember reading this one blog for my older one about what you should eat or something. And then there were, of course, comments like at the bottom of the blog. And I was reading these comments where people are saying all kinds of things like, oh, I don't eat salad anymore because of this risk. I don't eat this and I don't eat that. And by the time I finished reading all the comments, I was like, wow, if you literally followed all these people, you would not be eating anything. You know, there's like, you hear sort of more common things like, oh, don't eat raw fish, don't drink alcohol. And then some other people have strong opinions about don't eat deli meat and all this other stuff. But like, you can really, there's risk in literally everything you eat. So I felt like, well, this is kind of stupid. So I'm not going to read any more of this stuff because honestly, nobody knows. And I feel like in general, a lot of this health science stuff goes back and forth over the generation. So I felt like this was just totally useless and I was just going to go with my own common sense.
Yeah. That's funny. It's interesting because I notice amongst tech parents that I chat with, there's usually very little preparation. I feel like because people are busy and they just kind of like trust their own common sense versus like, like our parents that like may not be employed per se and like have like a single income household, like they spend a lot of time like worrying about these things and preparing for birth.
I feel like people overthink it and you can read so much literature out there. But I think my perspective on so many things is like, I mean, how do all these people know? You know, something that works for one person may not work for somebody else. So you just kind of got to do what's best for you.
Yeah. Did you work with an OBGYN or did you have a preference around your provider?
Yeah, I did have an OBGYN. It was a different person because I lived in two different cities for the two kids. But no, I mean, I think I mostly just looked up sort of general reviews and picked somebody.
Cool. How did you think about sort of splitting decisions around birth and your kids with your husband?
I kind of feel like we didn't make that many decisions, so there wasn't a whole lot to split. Like, okay, what hospital? Great. I never consulted him about my doctor because I was the one who was going to go in, right? Like the doctor was going to look at me, not at him. So, so that was kind of the only decision. I mean, I think other decisions post birth were around, you know, perhaps diapering. I think we had some grand ideas like, oh, we're going to cloth diaper, all this stuff. But, you know, day one, we're like, oh my gosh, cloth diapering takes so much longer than disposable diaper. So we threw that idea out the window. So I think, you know, we kind of just like adjusted along the way as we actually figured out what reality was. And we did end up like tag teaming a lot on so many things. And I'm quite grateful for that just because it was, you know, it really does take a village to raise a child. Like people are not kidding when they say that.
Yeah. Did you have any support, like in terms of nannies or family around?
My parents were so helpful both times. Yeah, they, you know, they were there both times and stayed with us and, you know, helped out for months on end. That was huge.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like it's very much customary in like Asian families to just have that like support very immediately.
Yeah. And I really struggle to understand how people are able to do all of this without any support. It's a really challenging thing.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Well, I'd love to delve deeper into your birth story, especially since you mentioned your son being in the NICU. So yeah, what kind of happened leading up to birth, and why did your son deliver early? And if you don't mind talking about it too, why was he in the NICU?
So actually both kids delivered early by a
Okay.
month. And in fact,
Oh,
it
wow.
was in exactly the same sort of way. So with my older one, I, I was about a month out, and I this is probably TMI, but like I noticed that actually um it seemed like I had peed in my pants just a
Mm,
little bit, but I thought, oh well,
okay.
pregnant women have issues with their body parts, but
Yeah.
then I felt like, gosh, I don't remember feeling like I peed in my pants, so this is kind of weird. Maybe
Mm,
my water broke a little bit, and then I started Googling this, and this was at maybe 4 in the morning or something. So I'm
wow.
Googling this, like how to know if your water broke, and of course it's not helpful because like you can't figure that out from Google. um so I thought, okay, well, this is a little bit weird. I'm not really sure here, because I don't actually think I peed in my pants, and this seems slightly different.
Yeah.
So we decided to, pack up just in case and go into the hospital to see if anyone had any thoughts on this. And while we were going to the hospital, my water fully broke in the
Mm,
car. And so then I knew, okay, like now I'm just totally drenched in whatever this liquid is. And that now I know my water did break. So that's
yeah.
how I ended up having to deliver, because when we got to the hospital, they said, oh, well, now that your water has broke, you have to go through with the delivery. Like, you
Mm,
can't keep the baby in there. So that's how I ended up delivering. And then that happened again with the second one as well. But
mm.
of course, the second time I knew exactly what was happening, because it was an exact repeat of the first time.
Oh, wow. Do you know why it happened?
I don't know.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. So how did you sort of experience birth? Like, did you have an epidural, or was it like pretty fast because your water had broken already?
I had an epidural. It was, I think, compared to perhaps other women's birthing experiences, it was pretty fast. But
Mm,
when you think about an actual, I don't know, time period, like we went in early in the morning and didn't give birth until 4 p.m. So I think,
okay.
it was still several hours
Yeah.
before I fully dilated to be able to give birth. They didn't induce me. They just felt like, okay, this will take its natural course. So we just kind of waited. But the second one, it was much faster. I gave birth around noon, so it was about half the time. Same
Wow.
situation again. Woke up early in the morning and my water had broke. So, but I guess people had told me, oh, second children tend to deliver faster anyway. And
Mm,
so anyway, that's how that happened. It is funny with my first one, like when I was in there just kind of sitting around, I overheard this woman kind of talking very loudly, like yelling, I want my tubes tied. I don't want this to happen again. And I was like, oh gosh, like what am I in for?
yeah. So did you like the process of giving birth, or did you think it was scary or too painful or anything like that?
I think mine was very straightforward, but certainly leading up to that in the pregnancy, it is incredibly uncomfortable to have like a big, essentially beach ball like that you're always lugging around. And I was only 8 months, right? I can't even imagine women who carried a full term. Like I've heard that
Yeah.
last one, really, really challenging. And then I was very lucky that things were fairly straightforward. I certainly have friends who were in the birthing process for essentially 48 hours or whatever, which I can't even imagine. You can't sleep, you're so tired, like it sounds awful. And
Yeah.
certainly complications can be challenging, but I was very lucky and didn't have that.
Okay, that's awesome. If you don't mind me asking, what age were you each time you gave birth?
Yeah, I think with my older one I was turning 33, so I was 32.
Okay, cool.
And in 2017, which was 3 years later, I was turning 36.
Okay. So was that one deemed a high risk pregnancy?
It was, yeah.
Okay.
And
Did you do
so
anything? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so we learned the gender earlier and that kind of thing, but they didn't do anything really different other
Okay.
than some level of testing as a result of that.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I interviewed an MFM last week and he was saying, it's funny that people even like, he kind of almost forgets that above 35 is considered high risk because in LA, it's like everyone is above 35 giving birth.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I certainly have many friends. In fact, I would say most of my friends probably have given birth 35 and onwards.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So during birth, I feel like a lot of parents try to do, or they have certain coping mechanisms that try to keep them as calm as possible. Like I've heard about parents like just basically watching reruns of Gilmore Girls and things like that, because it's meant to just help birth move more easily if you're like not under duress. So was there anything in particular that you did to make you feel peaceful, or like different people in the environment or anything like that?
I think the first one we were not very well prepared because when we went to the hospital, we didn't necessarily expect to stay there.
Right.
But with the second one, because it was a repeat, we knew, oh, we needed to take kind of everything in just in case.
Yeah.
So for the second one, I just played iPad games. Sort of fun fact, I think before I became a startup founder a long time ago, when I had a lot of time, I played a lot of Bejeweled. And if I had to pick out like a weird skill, like I'm actually pretty good at Bejeweled, if I may say so myself. Unfortunately, that's not a very monetizable skill. So
You could
I
Twitch
played a
stream
lot.
it.
I have thought about that. But anyway, I that's what I played for a few hours.
Oh, wow. That's so cool. Okay, awesome. So what position did you ultimately give birth in, if you remember?
I don't know, just in the hospital, like whatever that chair recline is in.
Okay, yeah. Is there anything that you wish you could have done differently with any of your births or anything that you would change in the future?
No, I mean, I guess given that it was very straightforward, I'm quite grateful for that. I think, yeah, there's nothing I would have changed.
Okay, cool. Did you happen to have any doulas or midwives that were assisting you throughout birth or pregnancy
Mm,
or even postpartum?
mm,
Okay,
No.
cool. And did you ever think about cord blood banking during birth?
I had gotten some materials on it and I had thought about it briefly, but I felt like I didn't, it was sort of thrown at you at the last minute when
Yeah.
everything is very chaotic.
Hmm.
And so it was one of those things where it's like, oh, I have zero time to think about it, and then it's too late. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's something that more people should know about
Hmm.
way before they're pretty much about to give birth. Like that's just not a great time to start learning about things. So
Yeah.
I feel like that, and also I think when I gave birth for both of my kids, it was a bit newer of a concept, or rather, less discussed for sure. Like I've never discussed that with any of my friends.
Yeah. Yeah, it is interesting. I think one of our like bigger missions is to make it as common as like how people ask if you got an epidural or not. Like I want it to
Right.
be that prevalent. So yeah, but it is interesting. Like typically we try to find people at around like 30 weeks. I feel like that's kind of a good time when people are beginning to prepare for birth, but it's still early enough that yeah, if you deliver early like you, then you're still like thinking about it and prepared. But we've also had parents like I think the latest we've gotten a kit to someone is when they were 4 centimeters dilated, they placed the order.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so in those cases, we just expedite it and do everything we can to get it there.
Oh my gosh. Wow.
Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to move into the postpartum period. How did you structure a routine immediately after birth? How did you identify what a routine should be? Like, did it come from your parents or yeah, just kind of what did that look like?
It was really challenging. I think because there's just so much sleep deprivation and people handle that in different ways. I personally don't do well with such sleep deprivation. Certainly when I was younger or when I was a founder before having children, I've pulled a number of all-nighters, but I feel like it's different because all-nighters are on your own terms,
Yeah.
but sleep deprivation because someone else is crying and you can't predict when they'll be crying, like, is a totally different thing. So I was not at all prepared for that. And I think my husband and I tried to tag team it where, he would go to sleep early and I would take care of the baby. And then he would wake up super early and I would go to sleep. Like, he would wake up at, I don't know, 2 a.m. is what I'm talking about. Like, he would go to bed super early, like maybe 5 or 6, or later 7 or so, and then wake up at 2. And then I would go to bed pretty late and then wake up later. And then my folks would come in the morning and, help out a lot, cooking, cleaning, handling the baby, etc. But I think even with all that help and that tag teaming, like, that kind of schedule really wears on you over the weeks and months. And I honestly, for the first one, felt pretty depressed, but I don't feel like I had any outlets. I mean, fortunately, it wasn't so bad where, anything drastic happened. But it was honestly very tough.
Yeah. I feel like I'm glad that you bring it up, and thank you for being vulnerable, because I feel like, not enough people talk about experiencing postpartum depression. And especially if you're like in the early stages of running a company, then, that can be kind of crazy.
It's also easy to say, because I think in startup culture, everyone's always trying to show that they're killing it. And so it's really easy to say, oh yeah, it's no big deal having a baby. But
yeah,
it was really tough. I think for the second one, in some sense it was tougher because now you have like 2 young children. But in other words, it was easier because I already had expectations set around, all right, this is what's going to happen. It's going to suck for the next 4 months, but we'll just plow through it. And so it's like, I could see light at the end of the tunnel with the second one, but with the first one, I just had no idea how long that would continue.
Yeah.
Like, will it be like this forever? And I think it was that uncertainty that actually makes it mentally hard.
Right. How did you cope with kind of like lesser mental health than you're normally accustomed to?
I don't think I had any great mechanisms. I really didn't.
Yeah. Did you expect or recognize that it was like depression that you were experiencing?
Yeah, I did know that it was, but I didn't know what to do about it. I mean, I have also had friends who have had postpartum depression, and theirs was way worse. As funny as it sounds, because I don't feel like I had my children super early, because I had my children earlier than many of my friends. I also felt like I didn't really have any guidance. Like, I didn't have anyone to talk with about this as far as my peer group went. So I didn't really have any resources.
So I know you talked about kind of shifting or like trading off like night shifts essentially with your husband. How did the routine sort of shift over time, especially as things got easier?
As things got easier and the baby was able to kind of drop a feeding in there or 2, then eventually, we still had sort of this tag teaming schedule for many months, but it was a lot easier where he didn't have to go to sleep as early or wake up as early, and I didn't have to go to sleep as late. It worked out a bit better. But I think then at that point, even if you're sleeping, say, 7 hours or 8 hours even, you still feel really awful because there were many months where you were only sleeping 4.
Yeah.
And so the catch up just takes a really long time. I think the other thing is the other reason why I think we were not sleeping that much, even though it sounded like when I said those times we were sleeping a lot, is with a preemie. Well, I guess my kids were both borderline preemies. Like, they wake up, I think, more frequently than a larger child, just because they need to feed more. They have smaller stomachs. And so, sometimes my kids would be waking up every 2 hours instead of every 3. And I think, that extra hour of sleep is helpful that we just never got.
Yeah. Yeah. Some parents that I've chatted with in tech, especially, a lot of them get night nannies. So was there ever sort of like a consideration around that, or a purposeful decision not to have one?
I think in hindsight, maybe we should have gotten a night nanny. So actually, if there were anything I would do over, it might be that. I think one of the things that we really grappled with was, honestly, especially with the first one, we didn't have a whole lot of money. And so, and night nannies are pretty expensive.
Yeah.
So I think that was just something that we felt like we can probably kind of muddle through it. I mean, I think the other part of it is also, as first time parents, we didn't know exactly what we were muddling through at the, initially. Certainly by the second one, I guess we did know better. But the other thing that I, found challenging was with the second one, actually, I felt like, okay, maybe my husband can just like sleep through the night and I could do all of these shifts, because honestly, I would be waking up anyway to pump. And
Yeah.
the difference between waking up to pump versus pump and deal with the baby is actually not that big of a deal. Like, the main issue is still you're waking up every couple of
Yeah.
hours. And so I that's the thing where I felt like, okay, then getting a night nanny may not be a great trade-off, because like I'm still waking up anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I'm curious what your relationship was with breastfeeding. Like, how long did you breastfeed? How did you feel about it? Like pumping versus formula versus, yeah, just the whole routine.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people had given us good advice to pump like from day one, because that's more scalable. And I guess that's how I tend to think, right? As a
Yeah.
founder. So, then anybody can feed the baby. But I think, breastfeeding is easier than pumping for sure. So I kind of did a little bit of both. But the problem is actually, I never really put in a lot of effort into this. And honestly, actually, I think, either pumping or breastfeeding contributed to some of my depression. It's very hormonal, and I don't know exactly the mechanism of how it works, but I was not feeling great. And so I did not pump or breastfeed for as long as perhaps I might have hoped. I think with my older one, I did that for, I want to say 4 months. And then with my younger one, I did that for 3 months. So pretty short period of time, I think, compared to many other women. But I felt just mentally so much better like when I stopped.
Yeah. Was it the obligation to it or the hormones that were
The
contributing?
hormones.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
I mean, I'm sure it's a combination of things, the hormones and also getting more sleep at that point. But
Yeah.
it really did not make me feel good. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really common. And I think like specifically like postpartum mental health is like discussed very little, but postpartum mental health in relation to breastfeeding, I find like whenever I talk about that on social media, it tends to go viral just because people like, and they'll always be like if even if it's a midwife, just basically saying it's okay to stop pumping if you feel like it's sacrificing your mental health. Like I always see comments that are like, this took a turn like that I didn't think it would take. Like people are just surprised to hear people even talk about it and to say that it's okay to let it go.
Yeah. I mean, I think my perspective was, all right, I'm a little bit disappointed in myself that I couldn't keep this up longer. But and part of that is, I guess, societal pressure. Part of that is just, I do think to some extent breast milk is good for the baby. It is natural. And I think the last part of it is just, gosh, like I'm not strong enough to like do this for that long, just a weird sort of self-pressure. But I think in the end, like mental health is so important in whatever it is you're doing. Like if you're not in the right headspace for whatever it is you're doing, like you should stop doing it.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that's just my general belief on that.
Yeah. How did you balance continuing on your company and or hustle fund as you were sort of experiencing fluctuations with mental health?
I mean, that was sort of also the other hard thing, right? Like if you're not in the right headspace around this, then you're not going to be in the right headspace for really anything. So I think, once I stopped pumping and breastfeeding, then that also made a lot of things just a lot better. Like I just felt more like my normal self and could do things normally.
Yeah.
So I really just think sort of those first, call it 4 months, was really, really hard for a number of things, certainly sleep deprivation, but also this pumping and breastfeeding thing. And that was what really made it hard to say run a startup or start a fund. But once we got past that, then yeah, I mean, certainly I was busier and a little bit more sleep deprived, but it was a lot easier to kind of go through some of these things beyond the breastfeeding and pumping.
Was there anything that surprised you most about birth and also postpartum?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I think, the first time in going through it, everything was a surprise. Even from sort of the little things of just, I had no idea how sleep deprived I would be, especially since I have pulled a lot of all-nighters before. I didn't really understand that. I think another thing I didn't understand was, again, the hormonal journey. Another thing I didn't understand was just when people talk about how women need time to recover, I did not know what that actually meant, right? Like I was wearing Depends diapers for several weeks on end. Like I didn't realize that all this stuff can come out of you. But I suppose what else did I expect? Like, how did I think babies were born and what happens after that? So, I mean, everything was just totally new. But I think what also goes with that is like, I didn't know that you certainly can't go for a jog like afterwards. You just physically can't really walk very well and all this other stuff. Like I did not know any of that.
Was there any advice that you got about birth or postpartum that you were like, this is the best advice that I've received?
I did receive advice from some people that was similar, which is around, you need to do things at scale and delegate. I mean, that's pretty much, I guess, the same advice you would give any founder. But I mean, everything from, we're talking about the pumping, but also anybody can do dishes, anybody can cook, you can order food. Like, don't try to be a hero and take on everything. It's okay to have like a messy living space. Like it's going to be like that forever, just kind of letting go on all these things, because you can really drive yourself crazy, like literally just trying to live your life, post birth. And I think the best advice that I got was like, you really need to let go on a lot of pieces. Have the baby sleep in another room. Like you need to get as much sleep as you can, like all this stuff, basically do things at scale. And that was really the best advice I received from multiple people.
Okay, awesome. And then kind of inversely, what was your favorite moment of birth and postpartum?
I don't know if there was a favorite moment at birth, but I think it's just like a really weird awe feeling, like seeing my firstborn, because it's like, wow, like you can actually create this other living being. That's just a weird feeling. It was also a very scary feeling, especially since, both my kids were in the NICU, and I was actually very afraid, like, oh, my firstborn just may not make it. Like in the NICU, those children are so small and they're so frail, and they're on all these crazy machines that beep every 2 seconds. You're just not sure whether your kid is going to make it. And those people in the NICU do amazing work.
I'm curious what advice you have for parents whose kids might be in the NICU as well.
My friend whose, I guess, sister was in the NICU tried to tell me to relax, but it is really hard. It is really hard when it's your own child in the NICU. And I mean, since then, like I've had other friends whose kids have, had to go to the NICU, and have certainly seen my friends get worried. And I think there's only so much reassuring you can do. Like you try to do the best you can, but parents will always still be worried, especially with their firstborn, about their child being in the NICU.
How long were both of your kids in the NICU?
My firstborn was in the NICU for about 2 weeks. And then my secondborn was in there for only like 3 days or something. Not that long.
Okay, cool. But yeah, I'm curious how you define your routine today with your kids. And also, since you mentioned that you sort of traded off with your husband, if those trade-offs continued into today.
The trade-offs do continue today. Obviously, those trade-offs are a lot easier now, like pickups
Yeah.
and drop-offs, who reads the bedtime story, that kind of stuff. It's way, way easier today. And I think in part because, to our conversation earlier, like my children are pretty self-sufficient. So, they get all their stuff ready themselves. And sometimes they don't do a good job of it. Like this one time I got a call from my son's school. I was like, hey, it seems like he doesn't have a whole lot of lunch. Oh, well, why doesn't he have a whole lot of lunch? Well, he didn't really pack a lot of lunch. And and I basically was like, well, is he starving? I mean, this may sound awful, but is he starving? And they said, no, we're going to give him some snacks. And I was like, okay, great. And then later when I picked him up from school, he really did learn his lesson that he needed to pack more lunch. And
Yeah.
I actually think that's contrary to what most parents would do. I think many parents would probably judge me and say, well, that was a very poor parenting move, but my child is not going to die of starvation at school, right? Like it's perfectly
Yeah.
fine. But I do think that like having children kind of learn those lessons earlier on is better, certainly better than when you're, I don't know, 22, right? And that's kind of the way that I operate with my kids. I have very high expectations of what they should be able to do at their age.
Yeah. Do you sort of teach them, I guess, like the rationale behind what they're doing, or do they ask, or are you just kind of like make sure to get these things done at this point? Or did you even think they understand like the rationale, especially at the early stages?
They do. I mean, I think kids are really smart and
Yeah.
actually can be self-sufficient if you let them. I think just most
Yeah.
parents don't let their kids do things on their own. Like even when my kids were both 3 or so, I let them pour out their own cereal. And a lot of people may feel like, well, kids don't really have the dexterity for that. They may spill it all over the place. And I think to some extent that's true. Like obviously when somebody first learns to pour cereal, like they're going to spill it. And, we had to clean up a lot of messes, but I had them do a lot of the cleanup of the messes. So they learned, okay, it's important to pour carefully.
Yeah.
And with practice, you get better at everything. And that's really what you're doing with them. You're having them practice a lot.
Did you anticipate having this parenting philosophy, or was it just kind of crafted as they went?
I think just as we've gone along.
Yeah.
And I think also part of it is just kid dependent. Like there are some things at the same age that my older one can do that my younger one couldn't, or vice versa. So it really also depends a lot on the kid, whether it's a task around dexterity or even around organization. Like my older one is just naturally very organized. My younger one like needs more guidance on that, but is getting there. So I think every child is different and has strengths and weaknesses just like everybody else.
Yeah. Yeah, that's super interesting. My mom was actually pretty similar, but I think sort of out of necessity, like she was working a lot, and I was kind of like, my parents were divorced. I mostly spent time with my mom, and then she was working, and then my grandpa mostly watched me because he moved into the house. I feel like that's like the Asian filial piety. But he didn't speak English. So like I had to kind of like figure things out on my own because I didn't speak Chinese. So I would just tell him like where I needed to be and at what time, but everything else, like I would figure out on my own.
Yeah, I mean, that's what makes total sense. And I have so many friends, like my age who were in a similar boat or something where they had to do, their parents' taxes at like age 12 or something. And it's just like, we don't think about that as being something a child can do. But you know what? Honestly, push comes to shove, a lot of people can do things if they are, if they have no other choice.
Yeah. Yeah. My mom would have me edit her like business documents because she's not a native English speaker.
Yeah, there you go. Right. So I think it's people step up to the moment like when they need to. And the same certainly applies for children. We just don't let them do it.
Right.
I mean, by we, I mean society in general doesn't let them do it. But
yeah. Okay, interesting. One of my last questions is, what is your favorite thing about being a parent? And yeah, what advice do you have for new parents?
If I'm going to be honest, for many years, I would say I didn't love parenting. Like, I don't think I love the baby stage or certainly not the toddler stage where they have so many temper tantrums and are unreasonable. But I think sort of the turning point was, around 4 or 5, like children can talk, they can reason, they certainly have a mind of their own, but like it's more rational. And so it is really kind of a joy to see them not only form their own personalities, but really grow and learn and just, become themselves. And that's been very rewarding.
Do you have advice for new parents?
I'm very much into sort of this scaled mentality, whether it's, at the baby stage of delegating things that you personally don't need to do, all the way through, I think where I am now in just sort of having your children do a lot of things. Like I think that has served me well. And I think, frankly speaking, I think it has served my children well as well. And so that would be my advice. Like, I think parents often underestimate what their kids can do, but kids can do a lot.
Yeah, for sure. Okay. And then my last question is, what do you think it means to be a good parent?
I think it's kind of two things. One is obviously sort of being very, very nurturing, whether it's being loving and caring, but also trying to provide the best for your children. But I think the other component is about parenting is again kind of a little bit going back to this scale and independence theme, which is my job, or anyone's job as a parent, is to get their child ready to be an adult. And so I think there is that second component that people don't often talk about, which is the coaching your child to become an adult and become an independent adult who's ideally not an asshole. So I think that's the part that is, really, I think, the definition of being a parent. Anybody can be nurturing and caring, whether it's other relatives or teachers. And certainly that's important for parents, like baseline table stakes. But the other component is preparing your child to become an adult.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. And both of your kids are boys, right?
A girl and a boy.
Oh, okay. Cool. Do you find a difference in like how you parent each of them because of sort of like gender norms and everything like that?
I don't think I treat them differently based on their gender norms, but I think they have different personalities that sometimes are related to gender.
Yeah.
My son, for example, has always, never been cautious. Like he'll like jump out of a car onto the sidewalk. It's just like, why on earth would you do that? I think that is, some of that is a little bit gender related, but I don't think we treat our children differently, or try not to, at least.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. Well, it's 10:59. So yeah, those are all the questions that I have, but I really, really appreciate you taking the time. This was really, really insightful. And I'll send you the tweet before I tweet it. But if you have any feedback, especially since you're so good at Twitter content, I would definitely love to hear it. So yeah, I'll let you know. And I'm doing one with Eric too, so I'm excited.
Oh, cool. Okay. Well,
Okay,
thanks, Catherine.
yeah,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, have a
Take
great
care.
day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.